not who we are. It goes no further than this. It stops right here, right now.
Hello, and welcome to Discovering the X-Files, the podcast in which a newbie, that's me, takes a deep dive into the entirety of Chris Carter's creepy universe, as longtime fans escort me on the journey, a journey filled with paranoid conspiracies and monsters of the week. I'm Erix Antoine, and today it's my sincere pleasure to welcome my friend Jim Laczkowski from a great podcast called The Directors Club. He's a longtime X-Files fan and fellow film buff, and today we'll be discussing the classic episode Ice, which originally aired in the US on November 5th, 1993. It was written by Glenn Morgan and James Wong, and directed by David Nutter. In this episode, Mulder and Scully, together with a team of scientists led by Xander Berkley and Felicity Huffman, investigate the mysterious deaths of an Alaskan research team. While isolated on this research base, they discover the existence of parasites that drive their hosts into a rage. And so the tension and paranoia escalates to a fever pitch for all involved. It's not unlike John Carpenter's classic version of The Thing. And after the break, Jim and I are going to get into it. Stick around.
Sorry we're late.
Hi, Agent
Mulder.
Scully.
Nice to meet
Mulder.
you. How you doing? Nice to
Dr.
Mulder.
Murphy.
Hi. Can I see some identification?
What for?
Want to make sure we are who we say we are?
Well, 2 federal agents, a geologist, a medical doctor, and a toxicologist. That should give us some idea what they're thinking.
Hey, so hi, Jim. Welcome. How are you doing?
Oh, great. It's an honor to be on the podcast. X-Files was one of the first TV shows that became must-see TV for me. I just realized, too, that the library I work at pretty much has every season on DVD, and since there are no late fees, I can pretty much keep it as long as I need to. So
that's amazing.
I'm gonna rewatch and follow along with you, for the purposes of this podcast, and just listen to discussions, because I remember early on when the show Lost was on TV, that's kind of when I became obsessed with podcasts, because I was listening to people analyze each episode after I'd just watched it. And so that was always fun to do.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of the purpose here, right? It's about going through it and, trying to just kind of watching along with me, because I'm a newbie, quote unquote, right? And so yeah, that's great. I mean, I appreciate that you're doing that, and I hope that the discussions are entertaining for you to listen to, as well as the ones that you participate in occasionally. And it's just great to have you, because I'm a big fan of your work.
Oh yeah, it's been a while. It's been a while since we talked, because I remember being a little conflicted about the director that we were discussing for Directors Club, but I came around to being more positive on several films than overall negative, as I initially thought going in with M. Night Shyamalan. And although I wasn't crazy about his last movie, I'm sure you like everything he's done, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I mean, I don't like The Last Airbender. Hang on.
Right.
I completely dislike that movie, and then everything else, I guess I vary from loving to appreciating. But yeah,
sure.
The only one that I outright hate is Last Airbender. I did enjoy the last couple of movies, but I know some people had their problems with Glass, and that's fine. But no, I thought it was great. Yeah, if you ever want to do a sequel, I'm here to talk about those last couple of movies. Yeah. Now about this though, so let's get this. The one thing I want to do, because like I'm not the fan, you are the fan, right? So I'd like just you give me a brief summary. What's your relationship to the X-Files?
Yeah, well, like I said, early on, I would say that this was probably the first show that I remember having a community of fans with. I think it might have been late high school, early college years, I'd say, when when I was one of my first jobs was working at a video store. I remember seeing the VHS tapes there for rent, and they pretty much like put, I think, 2 episodes per VHS tape, and that was it at the time. So it was almost like the X-Files greatest hits were available to rent, and I think Ice and Conduit were on the same VHS tape, if memory serves. And I just remember having various conversations with different friends, and even my dad, who he definitely leaned more towards science fiction than horror, but he definitely got into the show the same time I did. And we were started watching various episodes that were available either to rent, but then we sort of caught up with it on Fox, because if I'm not mistaken, it was pretty much like you get your double dose of Simpsons on Sunday nights, and then you get to watch the X-Files a little bit later on in the evening. So that's a quality like Sunday night of television from my experience. And one of our favorite crossovers was when Sculler and or Sculler Scully and Mulder appeared on The Simpsons, which to me is a hilarious episode.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So that was nice. And that's pretty much my history is just a super fan pretty early on. I think it was like the second or third season where I started to follow it on a weekly, regular basis, because I just kept hearing about the show, but never really dedicated the time until I started watching and renting VHS tapes of certain episodes. And, some of them were obviously out of context, and most of them were like the Monster of the Week episodes, which this one would fall under. So,
Right.
yeah, I adore, the X-Files, even though it does falter a bit towards the end, and that's kind of what I have a fuzzy memory of how things play out, and I haven't even watched the more recent season at all, because I just kept hearing very mixed things about it. So I'm not I've seen the movies and I've seen the majority of the episodes, but the new season I haven't even touched yet. So I'm sort of like going back along with you and revisiting the show in the same way I did with a show that's very similar. I did this last year, was the show Fringe, which I think J.J. Abrams and other people from Lost were involved with that show. But it was pretty much like their take on the X-Files, only with a little maybe more multiverse, time travel, sort of Star Trek-y kind of things going on in that show. But no, I think this is a standout. We're going to talk about a very standout episode from the first season, in my opinion.
So you jumped in around season 2 or 3, and people have to realize this is before the era of like streaming and binge watching. So back then, if you had to catch up, you were kind of on your own. You had to figure out how to catch up. If friends of yours had taped episodes, or like you said, they put them out on VHS. But one of the advantages, I guess, of this show, because it's from that era, is that you had a lot of standalones. And although there's like an overarching mythology, it's not only about that. It's not a serialized show. So I guess it's the sort of thing where you could jump in season 2 or 3, and then like a friend of yours who's been following can sort of fill in the blanks, and then you'll catch up eventually, And so that was an advantage. And that was my next question before we get to this specific episode. Are you, in your sense of fandom, because you kind of have 2 camps, right? So do you prefer the mythology episodes? Do you hate the mythology episodes? Are you more of a standalone Monster of the Week guy? Like, what's your take on it?
I'm okay with the mythology, but I'm not as passionate about it. I think because I grew up with Twilight Zone and Amazing Stories and like just more of the anthology shows where it was just pretty much a short story told in a half hour or an hour span of time. I think I do lean more towards the Monster of the Week approach to X-Files. I think that like those are probably my favorite episodes. Like I still have yet to make a top 10 favorite episodes of the X-Files, which would be fun to just do throughout the course of all of this, because rewatching something like a decade or 2 decades later, you're a different person at that point. So who knows what your taste is going to be. And certainly things are dated. But at the same time, I like to answer your question. It's pretty much I'm more inclined to be passionate about the standalone episodes versus the mythology. But I'm okay with the mythology because I have a tendency to believe that there is something out there. I want to believe, you know.
Yeah,
So
well, much like Mulder, yeah.
I'm down. I'm definitely, you know, I have my moments of skepticism about certain things, especially some of the things they cover on the show. But no, I'm definitely more Mulder than Scully when it comes to just the search for extraterrestrial life, and that fascinates me. So I'm definitely down for following the mythology all over again.
Yeah, so now let's get down to brass tacks and let's talk about ice, which I'll tell you, like, I'm sort of coming to this uh, relatively fresh. I mean, I have seen a handful of episodes over the years, but I was not ever like a hardcore fan that followed the whole thing. So I think I had seen this episode in the past, but I didn't remember it very vividly. And so watching it now, I'm like, oh, here we go. And I personally, like, so far, I'm gonna say this has been my favorite episode so far. I think it's fantastic. I think it's really good. I mean, even though it's derivative, I think it's deliberately derivative. It's deliberately derivative. Obviously, I'm pretty sure that Glenn Morgan and James Wong knew what they were doing. This wasn't an accident. You know, they're very consciously paying homage, if you want to use that word, to John Carpenter's The Thing. But and you know, they're inspired by the original story. Who Goes There, right? I mean, obviously they take that, but obviously aesthetically and in the way the atmosphere is, they're really going very hardcore into John Carpenter's The Thing. But I have no problem with that. I love that movie.
Of course.
And yeah, and I know that that's what they're doing. It's not like, oh, no one's going to notice. So we're, you know, they're very clearly doing that in many ways. There's many little signposts all over the place with that. This is what we're doing, guys. You know, follow along. So I personally love it. So why don't you go ahead as a fan to, you know, what do you think of this episode?
Yeah, I think this might be the best of the first season, possibly. I mean, again, I have to go back and also rewatch a ton of episodes because, you know, my memory isn't clear on every single one. But, you know, obviously this would be, I would think, in everybody's top 3 of season 1. Yeah. I certainly laughed out loud because they're not only starting with a shot of the dog, but it looks like the exact same breed of dog from The Thing. I was just like, wow, guys, yeah. You're really going for it here. But I gotta say, starting out, that cold open is creepy. I mean, when that guy is like, we are now who we say we are, I think that's just a great way to kick things off. And especially, geez, I mean, watching anything now where there's like a plague or a virus, it just feels very eerie. And when they use the word quarantine, I'm like, oh no.
Yes. Oh, yes. That was at the time that we are recording this. You know, we are at this time. It is mid-September of 2020. So, yeah, right now we're still kind of, this is on our minds. Yes. And to your point about like, okay, so you have the dog, the husky. You know, who seems to be the same breed of dog. And also they use several, because this was shot in a studio, obviously, unlike The Thing where they went out in someplace and they built this thing. This was shot in a set in a studio, but they occasionally use establishing shots. You know, they have like they have sort of like a grainy quality. It looks like stock footage. I'd have to look this up. I can't. Someone might know, but I would almost say, are those shots from The Thing? Like, because it basically looks like it, right? So I was just going like, they're not kidding anyone. It's like, that is what it is. Great guest cast in this one. You know, we've got Felicity Huffman and Xander Berkley, 2 good character actors. And I'm not going to go into, you know, Felicity Huffman may have done some questionable things in her real life, but you know, but as an actress, you know, she's a fine actress, and she gives a good performance. And I think it's just really funny because as soon as they get to Alaska, they are greeted by Kenny Banya, like right there at the airstrip. And that was to me, that was Seinfeld's own Kenny Banya. Just, I was going like, oh, you know, you're in trouble if that's the guy that's greeting you. And then I don't know, things are not gonna go well for Mulder and Scully if that's the guy who's saying hello.
And the helicopter pilot looks a little bit like Steven Tyler at times. It's a little jarring. When he's looking in the mirror, I'm like, was that Steven Tyler for a second? Is he turning into Steven Tyler? Oh no.
Yeah. His name's Jeff Kober, and he's like a character actor who's been in a bunch of things like B action movies. So I've definitely seen him, but right now I cannot place him. But he's a good character. He's the first one to break down and everything. He's got some great dramatic scenes. Looks like Steven Tyler. You're right about that. Well, anyway, so the way the episode is structured is interesting. You have Xander Berkley as one of the scientists, and I thought it was going to be guilty by casting, because obviously, like, you go when they're all trying to figure out who it is, like throughout the whole thing, and I was like, it's Xander Berkley. It's got to be Xander. Of course, it's Xander Berkley.
Well, he's actually the master of the asshole husband in a lot of
right. That's true.
Like Candyman. But he's a great character actor. I mean, when I think he gets killed pretty early on in Terminator 2, if memory serves. But whenever he shows up, I'm like, I'm looking forward to seeing what he does. But yeah, he does usually play a creep, and I think they sort of play against that, or like subvert your expectations about him. Obviously spoilers are coming up, but you'll find out who the one is.
Yes.
But it doesn't turn out to be him.
No, it doesn't turn out to be him. And you're right. I mean, I think by this point, this aired in '93, so yeah, by this point, audiences had seen him as the creepy stepdad in Terminator 2. They had seen him. They might have, I'm not sure, they might have seen him as the rather, obnoxious husband in Safe, the Julianne Moore movie.
I think it's a couple years later, but yeah, no.
Okay, I could be wrong. Yeah,
he definitely sort of embodied for a while that like the husband, the indifferent husband, or the husband who's not really being as present as he should be.
Yeah. I mean, he was basically. I mean, he's one of those character actors, as you say, who basically always plays bad guys. Like very rarely do you see him as a sympathetic character, and so. Like he was in the TV movie L.A. Takedown, which was the inspiration for Michael Mann's Heat.
Oh.
And in L.A. Takedown, he's the villain. He plays Waingro. So, I mean, I just that's Xander Berkley. That's why you're right. I think they were playing on expectation. I think they figured he's one of those character actors. He's one of those that guy, right? And it's the sort of thing where you recognize him. You go, yeah, right. This is the guy that always plays creeps. So as you're watching the episode, you're like, well, of course it's going to be him. He's obviously the guy.
That happens whenever I see Michael Rooker show up. I'm like, oh, well, there you go. That's the bad guy right there.
yeah, it's right. I mean, I recently revisited Cliffhanger, which is one of the rare movies in which like Michael Rooker plays a noble, heroic, likable character. And so it was, it's Rooker, I bet this is like, before this he played like serial killers and creeps, and so you go like, interesting that it's so rare to see that. Okay, so back to the episode. Let's see. So what are the best qualities here? What can we like really highlight as like the best qualities? We're saying it's one of the best episodes, and I agree. I think it's just the level of atmosphere. It's really tight. The performances are on point. David Duchovny does some of his best acting so far. He gets some good tense moments that he really sells, as the paranoia like starts getting heated up and everything. Like it's just a really good tense episode with great character conflict, really well handled by everyone, I think.
Yeah, no, but I love any scenario where people start changing or turning against one another in a confined space. And I think that probably goes all the way back to my, first exposure to Evil Dead 2, which, to me was like kind of like this gateway into horror and all sorts of things. Probably the first movie where I'm like, how does somebody actually make a camera do what is being done in this movie? And it's also eventually a bunch of people are sort of stuck in this sort of altered state. And I think that this story becomes all about paranoia and trust and establishing a stronger connection between Mulder and Scully when they're confronted with this kind of foreign substance. And they also have conflicting beliefs, and that obviously plays out throughout the show. But I think just their dynamic is really fascinating to experience here early on, since they're it's again, since we're early in the whole show, they're slowly beginning to develop their professional and personal relationship and how that sometimes conflicts with, their belief systems. And I think watching that here play out, especially when they're sort of arguing about how to handle the parasite, is sort of indicative of just what makes their dynamic so interesting and great to experience, because they're not always coming from the same page, and I think that's really great. But I'm also drawn to like two things that are difficult to pronounce, but one is panspermia. Panspermia. It's like this idea of a foreign bacteria or substance actually finding its way into our atmosphere from outer space. Like there's this idea that I think the story obviously was inspired by The Thing and maybe a little from Body Snatchers, but also I believe that there were actual scientists who dug up under some ice in Greenland, I want to say. I think they read it like an actual true story in either Time or National Geographic about these scientists who came across some freaky worms under the ice. So
Yes.
yeah, and that's the theory about like, oh, this could have been from thousands and thousands of years ago, and we don't know where it's from, and we don't know what it can do. Obviously, it didn't really cause in real life what happens in this episode, but it's certainly interesting to think about, a parasite being able to alter one's behavior or cause severe illness, because that's also like indicative of toxoplasmosis, which is really a freaky thing to discover. Like it can be found in cat feces or uncooked meat, and it can actually alter your behavior or cause very severe illness. So I think they sort of ran with all these ideas and made it just a very taut and tight episode where it's just a few characters dealing with something very, very intense.
Yeah. That part of it, exactly. It comes from, first of all, not correcting you, but just clarifying. It is true. They were inspired also by an article they did read about the fact that some scientists had found some 250,000-year-old worm or something encased in the ice. So it did come from scientific truth. And yeah, it's the idea of parasites that can control you, and that, I think we really see that, for instance, in John Carpenter's The Thing. If you look at how each of the incarnations of these famous science fiction or horror films, either in the 50s that were then remade in the 80s. So when The Thing was done in the 50s, they were obviously going for the whole McCarthyism, the communist threat. Like that was what was on their minds. But when Carpenter did The Thing, it was more of a metaphor for disease,
Yeah.
And the same with like Cronenberg's The Fly. Ultimately, I think that makes it a lot more palpable, and just more the idea that you could have this illness that is you have it and it's slowly eating you up, or it's changing you, or it's doing something to you. Obviously, they add the heightened level. They add the paranoia element to it, and you see that here too. It's definitely inspired by that, and it almost feels like the way the story is structured. It's almost like if you imagine that the film had been a hit in '82. Let's say it had been a really big hit, and they'd commissioned the sequel. And I think the sequel to The Thing would have essentially played out pretty much like this, because that's what it is. It's a group of scientists. It's a group of people going to the base after a crisis has happened, and picking up where those people left off. So it kind of feels like a sequel to The Thing. It's almost like what ends up happening to the research team that's there is like what would have happened if Wilford Brimley had his way and actually killed everybody. That's basically like what we see there. You go like, okay, and then people have to go and investigate what happened at this research station, and there you have it. So I do think that's intriguing. The tension between the characters is great. Going to Mulder and Scully, you're right about the development. The characters are still developing, and this is still playing off they're still getting to know each other. And that whole dynamic where he's the believer and she's the skeptic, and that's the dynamic that, as I understand it, plays throughout the show. But here, I think they both, he's the believer, she's the skeptic, but then she's actually confronted with the reality of the situation. So she knows, she sees, she experiences this thing. She knows it's something that's been in the ice. She knows it's something that's been in the ice for thousands of years. And again, what we see here, like her instinct is we need to destroy this thing. His instinct is we need to study it. And that's the interesting dynamic that I don't think is quite resolved. I think they make an allusion to it towards the end, you know, when they're about to solve the situation, you know, and she turns to Mulder and she says, once we do this, they'll all be dead, you know, kind of like telling him, you can't study this, and sort of like checking if he's okay with it. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, no, totally. And I it's funny because I think I would be more with Scully here in that, not just torch the place. I don't want this thing getting out to, you know, infect the general public, and that's always a concern in these films, is just like, you know what, and you know, it even happens in the cold open. If I knew I was infected with one of these things, and the only way to deal with it so it wouldn't infect somebody else, I'd take my own life if I had to. I wouldn't want to, but seriously, like the idea of this reaching, you know, similar to when Wilford Brimley is doing all his calculations on the computer, I'm just like, oh God, that's something we're dealing with too with the spread of COVID, just like how fast this whole thing blew up. But I know that they also bring up like the hypothalamus as being like this hub for this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which they bring up in here, and I've never heard it associated with anger before, so I may have to like actually look up if that was just something they sort of cited and, you know, used for the purposes of dramatic tension in this story. But I guess it's possible. I think it's one of those that I've always heard associated more with memory and learning and attention than anger per se. But I think that's a really creepy idea, is that this worm is going to turn you into, you know, the Hulk or something, like just going to turn you into this really aggressive version of you that is very impulsive and violent. So yeah. I think playing with that expectation and trying to determine, well, is Mulder infected or not, is really good. That's what you mentioned, David Duchovny's performance in this. It's really great, because you actually do for a while think, yeah, he could be infected.
And when they lock him up in the room, like Wilford Brimley, you know, like it's a little room with a little window, and I mean, in Wilford Brimley's case, it's a little shack, but you know, it's the same basic. It's a callback in a way to that. And as a viewer, you do think, because he does find, you know, Kenny Banya finds him dead. There's a moment where you're sort of doubting, even though the part of you that says, well, he's the star of the show. They're not going to make the star of the show a murderer. But at the same time, you go, yeah, but it's not really him, is it? It's the parasite. So
yeah,
you never know. It could have gone that way, and it would have been a dark turn for sure. But it certainly could have gone that way. And you don't exactly put it past the way the show has been building up to this point. When that revelation, when that happens, and you know everyone's doubting it, it's so well handled that you as a viewer, even though you know you're watching the show, and let's say you're a regular viewer, here we are 8 weeks into it, and you start to doubt, well, maybe it is Mulder, you know, maybe he is going nuts.
I mean, and also in terms of the creepiness of this episode too, you can definitely see the CGI as being very dated when they like show the worms in the little containers and they're sort of looking at each other, and you can tell, well, this is dated special effects, but I gotta say, when that worm goes into the dog's ear and stuff, I'm like, I'm creeped out. I find that really disturbing, because, you know, as someone who actually got infected in the senior year of high school with a very rare fungus, I think just that idea alone is enough to, you know, send chills up my spine throughout this entire episode.
I'll tell this. You're right. The effects are a little bit dated, but they're not. I mean, they're not terrible. Like one thing that I am appreciating about this series as I'm watching it, and here we are, you know, the 8th episode, and it's still the same, is something that they took a lot of care in the way that they did things, whether it's effects shots or action sequences or just everything. But it was always done with a certain minimalism, and which at the time they might have been thinking, well, you know, our budget can only allow for this. and maybe at the time they thought, these worms look kind of cheesy, blah blah blah, but whatever, it's all we can afford, whatever. But I think what it lends the show is a certain timelessness, where you can look at it and it's a little dated, but only in the technological sense. The minimalism actually allows it to hold up. That's what I think. I think like because it's minimalist, because it's restrained in the way that it shows those effect shots and just uses them very sparingly for storytelling purposes and just to make points, that you get a sense that it's a timeless show. You can watch it almost 30 years later and it still has an impact. It just feels like a really well-made old science fiction movie. You go like, oh, this is a science fiction movie from 30 years ago, but it holds up. The storytelling is very solid and very crisp, and the characterizations and that's really what you're focusing on. You're not focusing on the effects or that stuff. That stuff's there and it's fine, but you're focusing on the character, you're focusing on the dynamic, on the drama. And I don't know if this was a conscious thing when they were making the show, maybe to some degree it was, but it did result in the show not really being that dated when compared to other sci-fi shows.
No, I think you're right, and I certainly feel that way about Star Trek: The Next Generation. Going back and watching older episodes of that, and sort of appreciating it too in that regard, and also kind of realizing that, well, even if some of the effects aren't strong, they don't take away from you being immersed into the episode. It's like you could maybe for a second go, oh, that looks silly, but you sort of move past it because you're so into it. And I definitely had that case here where it was just like, oh, that looks silly, but also I'm so caught up in everything that's going on that I don't necessarily even look at it as a flaw. It's just a part of the overall universe, and certainly when the revelation comes on late in the episode, and it turns out to be Felicity Huffman's character, I certainly went, oh, well, there's a surprise. Way to go, guys. I hadn't planned or anticipated that. I mean, part of you hopes for a surprise in these cases. Like, if it had been Xander Berkley's character, I would have been like, well, yeah, there you go. That's exactly to be expected.
Yep. But since it turns out to be her, you're like, there you go. So they were playing with our expectations a little bit. I think they all figured, they're all going to think it's Xander Berkley. That's why it's going to turn out to be her. And now the only people who see that coming are people who watch the episode now, knowing what they know about Felicity Huffman in real life. They might be like, well, she's not entirely
okay. Well, this explains her accent stuff.
Yeah, there you go. That's totally, maybe, they do stick the worm in her ear and they manage to supposedly kill the parasite, but who knows? Something might have stayed behind. Now we know. Now we know the truth. Let's see. So what else can we say about this episode that we haven't said yet?
I'm trying to see. In terms of like, I think I really like the levity that Mulder presents, during really intense, crazy situations, like when they're taking off all their clothes. He says, just want to remind you guys, it's cold. We're in the Arctic.
Yeah,
I like that he's able to, bring a little sense of humor to a really horrific and scary situation that they're in. And I've always appreciated that about the show, that it takes itself seriously enough, but it also knows when to inject some humor to put a smile on your face for a brief moment or so. And I just, you'll see as the show progresses too, just how strong his acting, well, both of them, they just sort of evolve and become really fascinating characters throughout. But in terms of like just a great standalone monster movie of the week episode, I think this is definitely one of the strongest you'll find, especially in season 1.
That was something I wanted to bring up. I continue to be impressed by Duchovny's sense of comedy. He's really good at that deadpan. He's really good at that. Like, in the past 8 episodes, the actual quality of his acting will vary. I guess, depending on the director, depending on how comfortable he was at the time the episode was produced, I suppose. But in general, one thing that's always consistent in his character is this kind of laconic personality, this sort of deadpan attitude towards most things that is really very endearing and very, very appealing, I should say, very appealing and very, very engaging. And I think that that's something that and obviously his chemistry with Gillian Anderson is excellent. The two of them really work very well together from the get-go. So
Absolutely.
they always complement each other. And in this episode, I think yes, this allows them to do some of their best dramatic work because they have to go to that dark kind of tense place where they're forced to start to doubt each other, you know, and that and it's very well played and very believable that they want to trust each other. You know, like the scene where they basically draw guns on each other, you know, and he's saying, and you know, he's like, you know, it's me, you know, and she's like, I want to believe that it's you or something. And she says like, I want to trust you, but you know, like
You may not be who you say you are, bringing back the line that that we experience in the cold open, which I think is a great callback. And it's also worth noting the writers of this episode. You're going to find that they've written a lot of the best episodes. Glenn Morgan and James Wong, who would go on to sort of establish the Final Destination franchise, and they did some good stuff over their career. You know, I'm one of the few that actually likes the Black Christmas remake, and I haven't seen everything that they've done, but I've certainly go back and go, oh, they're responsible for this episode and this episode and this episode. So you're going to find that they're solid writers throughout this entire series.
Yeah, and I could believe that. I mean, I gather that this is basically how they got their start, right? The
For
X-Files,
sure.
and then
Yeah.
from this they went on to other things. But yeah, they're very solid storytellers, like that's for sure. And there's a level, and you can even see that in. I haven't seen all their work either, but I am familiar with the Final Destination films, and I enjoy them. I think they're a lot of fun,
Oh
and
yeah.
I think that because they are basically these fun sort of trashy B movies. You know, they're throwbacks. They're like slasher movies without a killer. You know, they're slasher movies with an ephemeral killer, but they bring a certain level of wit and sophistication to the work.
Mm-hmm.
And in whether it's Final Destination or like you see here, where yeah, they're having they're treating it seriously. You know, so this is a sci-fi show, a sci-fi adventure, a sci-fi mystery show, however you want to look at it, and they're looking and some wild concepts, whether it's a guy who can stretch, who eats livers, or this. It's a far out concept, but they find a way to ground it and give it intelligence and wit, and I think that's why it works. And yeah, they're definitely. I mean, so far of the episodes, yeah, they're probably the best ones. Have probably been the ones written by them so far of the first 8 that I've seen.
Yeah,
So
just wait,
I
wait,
can,
wait
yeah.
to get to the episode called Home. Oh boy, oh that one,
I'm looking forward to
that one's
that.
very memorable. I've always said, oh, that's kind of like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre of the X Files. It's just so disturbing.
Oh, well, I'll be looking forward to that. So yeah, so the final word is that this episode is great, right? It still holds
Yeah,
up. Again, I'm going to repeat, it's the best episode so far for me. The one I've enjoyed the most. I think it's the best crafted. It's got the best performances. It's the most engrossing. And you yourself, you said it's your favorite of the season.
yes, for
So
sure. I like I said, I'm still going through and seeing, how each season plays out and how everything holds up. But I think even just looking at the list of episodes, I kind of went, yeah, I think Ice is tops, and I'm glad that you had me on to talk about it.
yeah, and I'll have you back here in a couple of days to talk about another one, Beyond the Sea. And so definitely, I mean, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm really. You said you were honored to be on this podcast. I got to say, it's an honor to have you. I mean, I've always been a really big fan of your work. I'm really glad that you decided to sit down and talk with me about the X Files, and just thank you for being a part of this journey of mine.
I'm looking forward to joining you on the journey in general, and going back and watching one of my favorite shows of all time, because it's been a long time since I've went back and enjoyed this series, and I'm curious to see if even like this the more recent season is any good at all. So I want to watch them all if I can. So thanks again.
All
No,
right.
it's been great.
Terrific, and thank you. And and before we go, for our listeners who might want to check out your work or follow you in some way, why don't you go ahead and plug some of your stuff?
Well, I always direct people to go to nowplayingnetwork.net because there's so much content and so many great podcasts, not just hosted by me, but a lot of very, very talented people, including Patrick Rapole, who has a great horror movie commentary podcast called Tracks of the Damned, among many other great shows, including the one I've been hosting for close to 10 years now, which is crazy to think about, but Directors Club, which you can all check out at directorsclubpodcast.com, and feel free to follow me on Letterboxd at NowPlayingJim.
Mulder, just put the gun down and let Hodge give you a blood test.
Oh, so he can doctor the results? I'm not gonna let him stick a needle in me. He could be infected.
He has to be confined now.
Then just turn around and let us take a look at your neck.
I'm not turning my back on anyone. As far as I'm concerned, you're all infected.
Hodge is right. We ought to lock him up.
Mulder!
Scully, get that gun off me.
Mulder, you have to understand.
Put it down!
You put it down first!
Scully! For God's sakes, it's me.
Mulder, you may not be who you are.
And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, and if you did, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a like, take a minute to write a positive review, and go ahead and spread the word on social media. The podcast is available on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. Look for the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet, and check out my film reviews on Letterboxd. I would also recommend you follow Jim on Letterboxd at NowPlayingJim, but also please heed his advice and check out NowPlaying.net and enjoy a whole bunch of good podcasts, not the least of which is Jim's own Directors Club, which I'm a big fan of. He's been running it for about a decade now and always features comprehensive discussions of a particular filmmaker. They cover the gamut from P.T. Anderson to Robert Altman, from Brian De Palma to John Carpenter to John Cassavetes to Lucio Fulci. It's good stuff, and I'll be providing helpful links for all of this in the episode description. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back in a few days to talk about space. Not the final frontier, but rather a very weird X-Files episode in which legendary character actor Ed Lauter gets possessed by an alien ghost or something. My friend Natalia will once again be chiming in from Colombia to talk about that one. Please join us. And until then, let's all remember that the truth is out there. See you next time.